Hello. In episode 24.2 of AS for Architecture, I spoke with Patrick Lynch, founder of Lynch Architects, about their built work and about his writing, including 4 texts. Civic Ground, Rhythmic Spatiality and the Communicative Movement Between Architecture, Sculpture and Sight, published by Artifice. Progress is a Myth, Changes the Reality, a chapter in Changes the Reality, the work of Robin Walker Architects, published by Canalside Press. Part of a City, the work of Neve Brown Architects, edited by Patrick and Claudia Lynch and David Porter, again by Canalside Press. And Chapter 18 in The Hybrid Practitioner Building, Teaching, Researching Architecture, edited by Vogt, Schurz and Thomas, in his chapter Being With, A Tacit Alliance, Architecture, Publishing and the Poetic Reciprocity of Civic Culture.
When you find yourself called upon to work on very large buildings, on next to town halls, opposite cathedrals, down the road from train stations and the Houses of Parliament, for example, the question of the character of the ground plane becomes really important, not just as an academic question, but as the contribution that you as an architect can make, to use Hannah Arendt's phrase, experience the space of appearance.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of AS for Architecture. I'm today here with Patrick Lynch. Patrick, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Hi Ambrose, lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I studied architecture. I'm a practicing architect. I also did an MPhil at Cambridge after I'd studied architecture at Liverpool. And then subsequently I started teaching. I was very young when I was an academic. I was head of diploma at Kingston when I was 31 years old. And I always found it very difficult, or rather I think the institutions in the British architecture schools, found it very difficult to kind of reconcile practice and academic career. So I stopped teaching at Kingston. I was also teaching at the AA. Stopped that for a while, built some buildings, started teaching again at London Met, did that for a decade, and also was fortunate enough to complete a PhD with Joseph Rigbert, Peter Carl and Helen Mallinson. Published a number of books, and then bizarrely fell into becoming a publisher myself and an editor. I run Canalside Press with Claudia, my wife and business partner. And we've been lucky over the past decade or so to build some quite large projects, and we continue to build small projects. So we're trying to be a general practitioner. And I teach a bit. I supervise PhDs and masters at KU Leuven and UCL. I live in London and I've got 2 teenage kids.
There you go. From the sublime to the ridiculous. When I first came across your work, and I'm not sure, I think I've been aware of your work for very many years, but recently it was getting sort of in contact with you, I suppose, as both an academic and an architect, which is a rare combination and it's, I think, a wonderful combination, because I'm sure you experience this a bit. This division, this great divide between the two fields, 2 of the fields of architecture, between the academic architect and the work that we do in schools, in design schools, and then real life. And there's this constant kind of tension between the two. Recent changes to the ARB prescriptions for education are indicative of that tension, I think, a little bit as well. So I was just wondering whether perhaps you could open up a little bit about your identity as an academic that has, as you put it so elegantly, found yourself making buildings.
Yeah, that's a strange career trajectory. I didn't imagine it, but it was in fact because of changes, I suppose, 20 odd years ago in higher education, where polytechnics, this is actually a longer story, but when polytechnics became universities, I think they began to change the nature of the education they were offering. However, certain schools such as yours, I imagine, and Kingston and London Met still do offer fractional posts so it's possible for people to combine practice with teaching. The Russell Group universities don't, I believe. I think Neil McLaughlin has a fractional post at UCL, but that's kind of historical. He kind of got a 0.4 in the 90s and hung around until they had to promote him, I guess. He's completely brilliant, and I think he is a really good example of someone who keeps himself alive intellectually and culturally, and rejuvenated by dealing with theoretical and practical questions in college, and his practice is refreshed by the influx of students into it.
Well, what was your first interest? So, what was your first your forays into academia? You did this master's, and you have this PhD under Joseph Reichert, and you have theology in your background as well.
Yeah, I think I'm stuff with education. I always wanted to be an architect, and I don't see a contradiction between the two, and that's why I was giving the example of Neil, because I think he's one of the best architects in the country, and it's no coincidence that he's also a very good teacher. And of course, in other countries, for example, when you apply for a chair in European university, you have to send a portfolio of writing and building. So it's an unusual sort of situation that we have in Britain, and I think it has to do with a certain Anglo-Saxon contempt for all-rounders, and I think also the difficulty of architecture sitting in what were ex-polytechnics, art schools, and universities, and changes to the university funding model in the UK post-welfare state before we moved to a philanthropic endowed situation. So even in America, it's quite common to have professors of practice. But yes, I did an MPhil at Cambridge, Master of Philosophy in the History and Philosophy of Architecture with Dalibor Wesley and Joseph. Peter Carl. Joseph had left actually at that point, and that I think was instrumental in getting me a teaching unit at Hull, and then at Kingston, and then very young being promoted to and getting a senior lectureship there. But I was kind of building things, and I got married, and the cost of childcare is extortionate. My wife's an architect, and I didn't really feel like I was being supported by the school. I went from a full-time post to a 0.4, which was very little money, and it was very difficult to imagine having a family, and I was working 80 hours a week basically, doing lots of admin as well as lots of lecturing and dissertation supervising, and running a design studio. So I was really burnt out, I guess. So I took an unpaid sabbatical, and some projects moved forward. We got pregnant, and so I never really went back. But it was I think what I would say is I don't think I'm an academic. I'm a scholar. I think there's a distinction, and a lot of architectural academics aren't scholars. They teach design, or they teach practice management and law, and they bring to academia the vestiges of a career in practice, but they don't have PhDs, they don't have MPhils, and they're not research active. And some people manage to combine that with practice, and some people, such as Flora Samuel, for example, you spoke to recently, are not only exemplary scholars and theorists, but also operating with a kind of form of agency or social praxis, which is, I guess, a new form of architectural activity. People talk about it as activism. I would argue that all praxis is a form of activism if it's ethically oriented towards the good, and is practical and engaged in social political matters. A lot of architectural academia in America, for example, especially the kind of trajectory of people like Peter Eisenman, who was the first PhD in architecture, I think, from Cambridge, is very different. There's a kind of obsession with formalism and a retreat from the social character of modern architecture into a kind of l'architecture dans le boudoir was the great expression in in the late 70s and 80s, as if it was a very private activity, private obsessions. And I think we're moving away from that. And so you're starting to see, I suppose tensions is a good word, but I don't think they're irreconcilable. I just think that there are modes of practice which is possible to embody in one's own selfhood as a citizen and as a designer and as a teacher and as a writer, which are, they're not irreconcilable, but there are inevitably different sides to the life of being an architect. I mean, it's a kind of a contradictory activity, as I'm sure you know, it's partly scientific, it's partly legalistic, it's partly hermeneutic and historical and interpretive. Yeah. It's also very artistic, and it's a physical activity when you're making decisions with your subconscious and your body and in discussion with others. It's a studio. I'm a great advocate, I hope, for the physical character of architecture and the physical character of architecture education and the studio environment.
Yeah, I think that word that you use this word citizen, which is a useful segue. But I was thinking the other day about inventors. Architects are also inventors. Like they do precisely what we imagine inventors do. They sit down, they look at a condition, they find the problem, and they invent solutions. It's kind of a really mysterious job. And no one really talks about the architects as inventors, but we do talk about them, as you say, you know, practitioners and so on and so forth. But I love this idea about architecture being, all architecture, if it's any good, is activist. That there is this kind of citizen obligation. And it usefully brings me to the 4 texts that you shared with me, which cross quite a large amount of territory in terms of your thinking and your research and your writing, and obviously also your building. Your recent book, Part of a City, the work of Neve Brown Architects, the first one, a chapter from a volume you collaborated on, Being With, A Tacit Alliance, Architecture Publishing in the Poetic Reciprocity of Civic Culture, Changes the Reality, the World of Robin Walker Architects, and another chapter called Civic Ground. And I wondered if we could start with Civic Ground, because it's this idea of the ground in how I've read your work that I find most intriguing. This idea of the space of architecture. And I just wondered if you could kind of unpack this idea of the ground of architecture, the space of architecture, a little bit.
So Civic Ground is the title of a book that I published in 2017. It's a book that Black Dog and Artifice published before they went bust, and it's a version of my PhD, which was called Practical Poetics, towards the end of which I realised that if you added the epithet civic to architecture, as in civic architecture, it kind of defines itself in distinction from architecture which isn't oriented towards civic life. And in fact, the original architectural treatises of the Renaissance period onwards would often be described as architectura civile militare. So they would make a distinction between military architecture and civic architecture, or civil or city or urbane architecture. And in part, what my research was looking at was the relationship between artworks, sculptures in particular, and landscape and public spaces. And it was a kind of continued critique of the problem of object building, of thinking of architects as formalist objects in the guise of the world of Peter Eisenman and the East Coast obsession with architecture being a kind of art in itself, without being the art of architecture, which is essentially the collaboration of all the arts and the role of the architect as a kind of orchestrator of relationships, artistic, social, political, cultural. And that actually, it's easier, as you just said, it's the ground condition that's wrong with these buildings. Rickvert points out that if you look at the Dubai phenomenon, or what he calls Emirate style, really it's just space left over after road engineering. So the kind of twisted shapes of the buildings are there because they're just the economic diagram of turning circles for refuse vehicles and stuff. And so a lot of what architects are pretending to be doing by being like artists is actually just a misdirection. It's just because they have no agency, and they're pretending to be sculptors, but actually their understanding of how the artist works is farcical and very limited. And in fact, most artists are very critical of object makers. So you see people like Donald Judd critiquing Yves Klein, and Richard Serra critiquing Henry Moore. He said, a garden gnome on a lawn is more situated and has more cultural meaning than a Henry Moore that can be kind of towed around and parked in front of a modernist building. And so it struck me that the problem of civic ground is a kind of artistic problem and an ontological problem. What is an architect? What does an architect do? Who are we? How do we think about ourselves? And how we might learn from how, on the one hand, activist artists work, but also that there's a kind of tectonic dimension and a formal language question within the work of these sculptures I mentioned, which we can learn from. I mean, so famously, one thing I discovered doing the research when I spoke to Luis Chillida, who's Eduardo Chillida's son, when Frank Gehry was commissioned to build Bilbao Guggenheim, he turned up at Chillida Leku, the house and estate, the museum of Eduardo Chillida, and asked him if he put a sculpture in front of the building.
Gehry did.
Yeah, Gehry did, and Chillida kind of what's the word I'm looking for? He mischievously replied, "Oh, but my sculpture would be in conflict with your sculpture, Frank." Kind of ironically, and Frank went, "Oh yeah, good point, yeah. That's maybe we don't do it." And but Serra also, when he exhibited at the Bilbao Guggenheim, literally put his foot through the wall and got really enraged. He was being interviewed for Icon magazine. He just said, "This is just a piece of shit. It's made of plasterboard and thin bits of Baker foil, and it's pretending to be sculpture. You try and do that to one of mine, and your foot will come off really, really badly." So there's a kind of tectonic issue, and I kind of was interested, like in a nutshell, why is American architecture so bad when it costs people are putting half $1 billion into going to do a master's at an Ivy League school, and why is American sculpture so fantastically brilliant? Land art, perceptual art, people like Robert Irwin and Walter Della Maria, and actually it has more in common, I think, with Renaissance culture in that the themes of being in the world, relationship between natural phenomena, weather, communal gatherings, ritual time, are more like Baroque culture than they are like the kind of alienated world of the art gallery. And that a lot of architecture, which purports to be like sculpture, doesn't really understand the spatial temporal dimension of this. And really it has to do with the question of landscape and weather. So ground it is a kind of construct itself as an idea, but it's a very important philosophical construct. Eisenman talks about this, but it's not just a philosophical concept. It's also, it's sewerage, pipework, it's party wall law, it's the right to gather and to protest. And the grounds that we have in common, the grounds that we have to base our agreement upon, or the grounds that we have to disagree, and the right to disagree, are closely related to motive and to mythos and to plot and idea and the kind of ethical dimension of what we do, and its artistic potential to be things that we have in common. Now, I'm not disinterested in form or rhythm and tectonics and material culture at all. In fact, that's the kind of subtitle of the book, deals with these themes. But I am also, when you find yourself called upon to work on very large buildings, on next to town halls, opposite cathedrals, down the road from train stations and the Houses of Parliament, for example, the question of the character of the ground plane becomes really important, not just as an academic question, but as the contribution that you as an architect can make to allowing citizens to use Hannah Arendt's phrase, experience the space of appearance. And so these things kind of come up that I don't think architects generally are cognizant of them, because we tend to either be trained to focus on abstract form making or on activism, but as in, like, working as an NGO or imitating participation. But in reality, the job of an architect now is to mediate between all of these abstract planning laws, clients' kind of abstract demands, and to consult with large groups of people, including politicians, activist groups themselves, Historic England, 20th Century Society, people who have who actually care about the city more than they care about architecture. They care about buildings, and they particularly care about the capacity for human beings to be in public together. And so when you are in between a town hall and a cathedral, that Catholic cathedral in the case of Victoria Street, the whole ceremonial, ritualistic, theatrical dimension of city life is, it's writ large. There's just endless Lord Mayor's parades and Palm Sunday processions, etc., etc. And that, I think, is a kind of academic interest begun in I published a book about the theatricality of Baroque space and the secular and sacred rituals in Dresden and Florence and Versailles, for example. But I think they're kind of live because they have to do with that which we share in common. And I think ultimately this is what architecture is oriented towards, and its potential is to embody, articulate, but actually just make space for these things to occur, and for other artists to complete. And they might be poetry readings or the intangible, ephemeral, transient theatrical character of public life. Or, for example, we designed a public space, worked with an artist, a space next to City Hall. The politicians decided they wanted to erect a memorial to the men and women from the council who died in the First World War. It didn't consult with us. They kind of dropped a kind of rather silly object into the space, but it's a sign of its success that people understood what the space was for.
Yeah,
we created, and I can't control that. All I can do is set in motion, I guess, or rather to appreciate the forces that are already in motion, and to work with them to allow certain things to happen, other things to be perhaps to be restricted. To be able to stop certain things happening.
So how do you go about? It's a really fascinating idea, and it's a really rich idea. There's a kind of profoundly poetic notion to the role of the architect in this. Not only poetic in the sense of sitting there and thinking complex thoughts, but also I think there's a poetry in this idea of the architectural designer as a coordinator of social action, which I think is a very beautiful articulation of what it might be to be an architect, rather than, as you say, a kind of dropper down of objects, which has absolutely no correlation to the human experience, the bodily experience. Sort of in a way, I always think of those buildings as a kind of the end point of where Le Corbusier's Le Modula took us, or Vitruvian Man. It's a sort of, if you adopt an avatar for a person, you're going to end up with buildings that look like this almost inevitably. It might take 40 years, and that's where we are. But I wanted to ask, how do you register and how do you measure? And then how do you communicate the idea of ground? So what are you looking for and how do you document it? And this is sort of, I assume, before you get to the point of design. So before you get to the point where you're producing drawings and models and you're communicating with people through those things, those tools that we have as architects to kind of make sense of our proposals, how do you, first of all, simply approach the site? What are you looking for? And then how do you communicate the value of that to a client who probably has very different values to use, particularly with some of your bigger buildings? I'm assuming, without wishing to be rude to your client, at Kingsgate, a zigzag building, they're probably looking to turn a profit. One would hope.
Yeah, the city is a kind of a site of exchange and commerce, and the transformation of those things into virtue is Alberti's kind of definition of an architect and what of architecture is, that you're engaging with forces. Those forces are political, economic, social, and artistic. And so that's what I mentioned being a citizen. I mean, if you don't read widely, if you don't read a newspaper, and you don't read the LRB or other journals which expose you to the work of economists, physicists, and poets, then I think you're going to have a very deprived conversation with one's clients. I mean, my experience is that clients don't want to build shit buildings. They want to make a profit. Obviously, I mean that's that's what gave us Renaissance Florence. Delusional about and ancient Rome, and the Greek polis. I mean these. And it's the things that give us money to build art galleries, universities, town halls. If you look at the Victorian city, it's not founded entirely on philanthropy. That philanthropy grows out of a sense of civic pride and duty, which is possible because they're economically successful and powerful. And so partly that's a reading of the site, if you will, or a reading of human history and a reading of the city that we're in. I personally, I tried to adopt two methods which actually grow out of being a teacher, which is the very powerful role of observational photography, spending time not just photographing the site as objects or as materials, but the life of a place. And so I was lucky to teach at London Met, as I said, for a number of years, and there were two design modules in the fourth and fifth year, and in the final year in particular, design and resolution followed on from design and proposition, and that module included lots of reading. So students would read outside of a town, and depending upon the city we were working in, they would study. And in the example of Porto, they would go and talk to people like Alvaro Aziza and interview them. And engage in proper consultation with local residents, the mayor, who was also an architect. Those kind of getting to know a situation as a human being, as a citizen first and foremost, but hand in hand and coincidentally, at the same time, coincidentally, you can learn so much through making a model. So the act of documenting and photographing and making a scale model at 1 to 500, 1 to 750 reveals to you the latent character and structure of the city, things that have got obscured through the treatment of the city as individual building sites or individual building blocks. So specifically those parts of the modern city that have been messed about by road engineering and by that kind of introverted functionalist approach to individual building sites. Nonetheless, it's all still there. If you build a model, in the case of Victoria, you see there are schools, hotels, housing, gardens, political buildings, listed buildings, and alongside that kind of physical work of being, which is bodily, and of being surprised and seeing things, one should also be mapping the situation in two ways. I mean, I suppose Peter Carr once said that the ideal student project should be a combination of information and poetics, and therefore one is able to make an argument which is inevitably intuitively driven as much as observational and analytical, and somehow within that mix of stuff, ideas emerge. My experience of this is there is such a thing as talent, and there is such a thing as luck, but you have to kind of make the circumstances for this to occur and to appear. I'm still completely flabbergasted. I go to crits all over the world, and there's no site model. There's scarcely any site investigation, and people are assuming that they're experts, or they just talk about what they want, as if anybody cares what architects want. Yeah. And that seems to me to be a lack of craft and skill. That the skill of an architect involves the ability to make reasoned arguments and to demonstrate visually that those, and not just that you're trying to persuade somebody because you've made a CGI or an image and isn't this beautiful object so cool and going to enhance the reputation of the client and the planners and everybody else. But not to be cynical like that, but instead to realise that the power of an argument for an architect comes out of discoveries that you've made, which are visual, physical, conversational dialogues, and therefore the ring of authenticity, the capacity to get projects, unanimously through planning committees made up of very skeptical, often hostile groups of people. It depends not on flim-flam or rhetorical, hysterical flights of metaphor, but instead simply behaving as a professional, being an expert, knowing about planning law, knowing about the ethics of sustainability, the desire for people to make money by being virtuous, which was Alberti's challenge. And it sounds mysterious, but I mean it is. It's bloody difficult being an architect. It's an unusually strange activity. Most people who go to university are just writing essays, or they're cutting up bodies. They're not cutting up models and writing essays and doing building moment and U-value calculations and making drawings and having to stand there and defend themselves.
Yeah,
but that's unfortunately what happens if you want to win work and you're competing against people who are similarly desperate for the work. You need to be very convincing. And even then, you then need to persuade, as I said, planners and politicians and local residents whose default setting generally is not in my backyard, that what you're doing is in their backyard, that you know about their backyard, and you don't know about it in the way in which they do because you don't live there, but you're bringing to it global knowledge, bodily knowledge, theoretical knowledge, and optimism and good ideas. But it is mysterious, but it's not that mysterious. I mean, it's literally not rocket science, is it, or brain surgery? I mean, it's not that difficult. But I do think we live in a funny situation where skills which the tradition of architecture, which is full of the tradition of model making in particular. If you go to the Museum of the Duomo, for example, in Florence, they've got the 1:25 and 1:1 models from all of the competition entries for the Duomo. And if you look at the stuff that's in the V&A's collection, we have until very recently had a protocol and a way of making work. Now the computer is brilliant, as I was alluding to earlier. The wonder of Revit is it's forcing one to not just draw lines or to make SketchUp models which have no thickness and no dimension and no orientation and no thermal and thus ethical orientation. But we are. Architects are obsessed with neologisms and new ways of working, as if we can be liberated from the gravity of a situation, its physical and its political gravity.
I think that's a brilliant way of putting it. Liberated from the kind of the gravity, the physical and political gravity of a situation, and I think that gets to the heart of it, because this idea of the ground that you've talked about is about a sort of a way of situating your experience or your knowledge or your interpretation of a site. Like ground is one of those words. Like when we talk about sustainability, we talk about the environment, we talk about the earth and the climate. Yes. And these are wildly inappropriate words to talk about something that people register on their skin.
Yeah.
It's like the scale of them is useless. And it's like when architects talk about, I don't know, the site, and it's got this abstract kind of quality. But if you start talking about the ground, you're talking about something that people feel clean off their shoes. You clean the dust off, you get under your fingernails. There's something very visceral and common about it, ordinary about it. Is that kind of what you're getting to? Is that the architecture that you kind of work towards has this civic life, which is based around, it's not like everyday culture, because that's a kind of rather hackneyed postmodern trope, but it's sort of something more ordinary, something more mundane, more, I don't know. I don't want to use the word real, but I'm going to use the word real. Something more real.
Yeah, I was telling you an example of something that I'm really impressed by is Liza Fionn-Muff's ability to not just talk about bottom up as a kind of political or analogical kind of description of participation and activism as an architect, but literally to manifest it. And so the large office building that we have on site at the moment has a 1.5 meter fall across its site, and thus the two entrances to the office building, one requires a disabled access ramp, and musts and JLL given to the working on the public realm and landscape, and the kind of what one would assume to be the kind of beautiful or the frivolous, but in fact is actually the legalistic and the ethical way. How do you make an environment for wheelchair users, impaired people, visually impaired people, to enjoy this and to access the building? And their response is to create a 1 in 21 curving arching ramp, which is actually a garden with places for people to sit. And that geometry is partly informed by the fact that there's a part of the kind of overhang of the entrance soffit externally to the building, where we need to have a 10-meter diameter circle in the ceiling to enable the fire brigade and emergency services to lift up a Gatic lid, i.e. a massive manhole, in case of a flood in the sewer, which has the River Tyburn in it below the ground, flooding the Victoria Line tube station. And so
which would be a disaster.
Yeah, which it is 400 meters from Buckingham Palace, so that it could be could really be a disaster. The Buckingham Palace could fall. What everyone thinks about that is an idea, regardless to our professional obligations to avoid that. And so from these two kind of the most surreal and grounded and ordinary and absolutely mundane, but also advanced scientific, technological, matters, comes a poetics of curvaceous architecture, which creates a garden and a space for performance. And that attention to the absolutely mundane and ultra mundane is what Muff in particular are really good at. But the problem is that when people look at other architects' work, we I don't know why, I'm bemused by it, but we tend not to want to know about the dirt on the ground and the mud under the fingernails, and we like to fetishize things. I mean, it is a paradox, because architecture is an art form, and we're all infused and inspired by and enthused by seeing other people's work and finding its kind of haunting, mysterious character. But I think there was a kind of quality of soul involved in this, where how you're able to be both working intuitively, instinctively, visually and physically, and at the same time cognizant of sewers and tube lines and disabled people's rights, these obligations and duties that we have as professionals. It gets easier, I think, as you get older, because you get used to being not just one person. So you can be a teacher, a parent, a lover, a son, a daughter, part of a football team, someone who sings in a choir, a counsellor, all these various aspects of being a human being, of having personae rather, and having not just one fixed personality. I think one of the problems with the way in which architecture is taught at the moment is that when I was a student, for example, and I sound like some old buffer now writing a letter to the Telegraph, and I hate this about myself, but the welfare state paid for me to be educated. I was the son of a working class economic migrant from Ireland. Nobody in my family had ever been to university, and it was completely free at Liverpool University. And our tutors would endlessly refer to the fact that people were in the streets digging holes in the ground in the rain, whilst we were poncing around in the warmth, indulging ourselves. And so that there was a claim always made to the bargain between the people who are paying for our education and our role as modernist trained architects. And I think that's what Neve Brown felt, although he came from a much more elevated economic background than me and my colleagues at Liverpool. Who's kind of been to a public school, had turned down a place at Oxford, was at the AA, but nonetheless, because his father wouldn't fund his studies at the AA because he rejected Oxford, he felt an obligation to build for working people. And the great joy of finding out more about Neve Brown was to discover that he was also teaching at Cornell with Colin Rowe, and at Princeton with Ken Frampton and Alan Colquhoun and others, and Bob Maxwell, and also a great writer. And so his critique of the modernist point block i.e. a lot of housing that had been built by the GLA after the Second World War, was to take a party wall type and a garden, and to make that the basis of Alexandra Road. So it was critical production. It was also interesting to find out that when he was at Cornell, he got permission to go there and teach for 15 weeks. He was getting up in the morning and he was faxing. Fax has just been invented. Faxing with the QS. So that, the fact that you walk around Alexandra Road and you aren't really aware that there's hundreds of cars buried in the existing topography of slope of the site, and that the car isn't dominating, and that the idea of the car, i.e. the idea of the individual and their right to have their mechanical propulsion system fuck up the rest of the city, which blights most other housing in the period. Think of Lasden, it's a beautiful form, but it's a sea of cars. And everything that we're doing in our housing projects for Hackney Council is fixing this problem of the ground, which is, in Corbusier's 5 points, as you alluded to, is given over to cars or plant.
Mm-hmm.
And Corb makes the kind of shortcut in Oeuvre Complète Volume 6 to say, when he's showing the mill owners, for example, he's saying, we don't need textile artists anymore, I can do that. And Ronchamp, we don't need stained glass artists, I can do that. And he says, you don't need a sculptor now to adorn your buildings, architecture is sculpture. So yes, there is a long trajectory of contradictory things where within modernism there's a global project at the end of the Second World War in America and in most of Europe to build housing for heroes, to create a just society. But the car creeps in as a symbol from America, as a symbol of individuality. And the ego of the architect is, it's A.N. Randian's Fountainhead. There's this kind of malicious taint of world making that becomes, very selfish and very, very disengaged. So the touchstone, I think, for any professional, be it friends of barristers and doctors and stuff, is the embodied. It's case law and it's in a Hippocratic oath, trying not to do wrong. And I think that's at the back and lurking in the ARB and the RBA's response to the Grenfell fire tragedy, which is a reconstituting of the idea of health and safety, not as burdensome, boring regulation, but as a primary duty. And having been on an RB education committee for the past decade, I kind of realised where they're coming from. The government cannot understand how it's got itself into a pickle with design build contracts and architects not having any authority or responsibility. But then, as Owen Hathley pointed out, if you look at the design access statement for the Grenfell Towers recladding, there's not much in there about ethics. It's mostly trying to persuade conservative voting house owners in large Georgian houses that rather than looking at ugly grey concrete blocks, they will be looking at shiny sculptural objects.
Something more shiny.
Yeah, what I mean? And so there's a lot of architects would be quite happy to just do shiny objects, and there's a lot of money in it, and there's a certain degree, I guess, of artistic satisfaction if you're able utterly to disengage your ethics from your aesthetics. Actually, I think we all feel it produces bloody ugly buildings and kind of stupid buildings as well as ultimately killing people. So the response to the changes to the curriculum are perhaps going to lead to there being more practitioners teaching in schools of architecture, because in the interregnum, the past 20 years or so of changes to the funding model, the kind of voracious appetite of the vice chancellors to have full-time members of staff bringing money in via research is kind of, well, that's fine if you're in English, or is it even fine in English really? I don't know. You'd expect English scholars to be wanting to write books anyway. It works well in the medical sciences and the hard sciences, material science in particular. But does it really work when you're training professionals and you're training people to do a good job for society at large? And why should we have to pay to educate our children? It's completely wrong. Every other country in Europe doesn't have this. It's nuts. We've turned it into some kind of commodity. And one consequence is all the practitioners have been kicked out, and you've got people like you and I with PhDs being forced to make a choice. And because the university wants you to be full-time doing work for them. But the thing is, the students are paying nine grand a year. They expect to be taught. That's a decent deal. Make money out of material science and pharmaceuticals if you can do that. don't treat every subject the same. It's crazy. But it's a short-term political thing. Hopefully, it will change at some point. We have a change of government. But I'm sorry, I'm on a political rant now.
No, it's legitimate because this is my daily reality. But it is at the same time, it's not. I think what's interesting about it, just to go political, I may as well, is it's. I think all of these movements come both from the bottom and the top. So the government is enacting. It's very difficult to persuade students to turn up to tutorials. They pay and they don't turn up because the idea of work as a civic responsibility. I was talking to a man on Sunday who completely changed my idea about work. He said the first purpose of work is the common good.
Yeah.
So the point of work isn't your pay, it's paying into the system that enables you to work.
Yeah.
And it's like, when you adopt that perspective, that completely crashes the whole neoliberal economic model. That's the whole logic of, the last 500 years through the floor, because obviously that's true. Because I couldn't make any money teaching in university if there weren't the roads, and there's no bandits on the roads, and infrastructure and electricity and internet, all of these things which none of my labors vaguely compensate for the complexity of my life.
Yeah, but this is civitas, this is city life, and the highest expression of civitas is civilitas, which is civilized civic life, of which architecture is the most visible component. I think we're living in. I used this phrase last time I spoke to you. We're living in a kind of post-Christian Protestant work ethic situation where people are working for no purpose other than a kind of residue of a theology of money, and one's
which they don't even get anymore.
Well, they don't even get anymore. I mean, we're kind of screwing the planet up, endlessly making stuff for no fucking purpose, and it's a very strange one. I mean, this is the distinction that Hannah Arendt's making in her kind of critique of Marx, is that that the human condition is about the relationship between the vita activa and the vita contemplativa, and in the Enlightenment rationalist, Reformation worldview, the life of a monk or a nun in a monastery is completely pointless. Contemplative work is bullshit, and that you get people like Kant trying to square the circle and going, but art's useful and interesting because it is subjective, and it's not useful. But we need to have some people like that in our society. But that then, where does architecture sit then in this? Because architecture is not a useless activity. It's not something you can do in your own in a garret or a tower. It requires hundreds of people, and it's generally a commissioned art. There's a kind of missile. There's a point to it. There's an aim. There's a common good, and it's the role of the architect traditionally to understand what that is, because part of brief writing, the RBA, work stage. The beginning of your relationship is to interpret your client's brief and to help write a brief, and that means testing what for example, the planning brief for the site might be. Now, the idea that we can somehow do what we want, and I think that's how architecture is being sold by vice chancellors. Is it's a kind of artistic activity. You can come along and do what you want, and the problem with crits is it reveals that you absolutely bloody can't.
No.
And it's a painful, difficult process because there's always knowledge that we don't have. But if we want to be design team leader, i.e. we want to be the people who get paid properly to synthesize the knowledge of the various scientific disciplines, structural engineers, service engineers, ecologists, etc., pigeon specialists, disabled access specialists, we need to know enough about what these guys do to know what actions need to be made. But that kind of traditional education that you and I got at provincial universities is boring, it's expensive. And if you've been told you're a consumer, you don't want to come along to a crit and be told you don't know something. But the problem is we don't know things. We've all got blind spots, and we don't learn unless we accept that. Now, conversely, the relationship between work and reflection, or contemplation, as the ancients would call it, is the key. Is that you make work. There's a kind of drive, a kind of physical joy and glee, or even, compulsion to do that, and that sometimes can be a bit headless, and but if one is also able to become reflective and to be mature and take criticism and say, I've made this work. The ideas behind it are these. I realize I may be fooling myself about whether this works or not, but I'd invite your comments. But I'd like to say that what's structuring this is a series of thoughts. Then it's a much less confrontational, a much more collaborative, and a much more civic-oriented conversation. But because, as you correctly pointed out, neoliberalism has this compulsion to treat individuals as independent economic objects and to see students as consumers, people get very, very emotional about stuff which is really not worth getting emotional about. It's simply a professional training, and one is learning. And as a consequence, people don't want to learn. They pay all the money, but they don't want to be told that they're not what they don't know yet. But it comes from an ontological disorientation, a misunderstanding about what an architect does. I'm always kind of, it's surprising. I mean, you go to doctor's surgery now, they're mostly wearing jeans. It's not like the olden days where doctors wore tweed suits.
Yeah.
And lawyers still generally wear suits, but not really ties anymore. But you go to an architect's office, it looks a bit like, I don't know, like a rock band, but actually we're as regulated as the legal profession and medicine, and in some cases much more so.
Yeah.
Because the issue of escape from buildings and access to buildings is at the heart of the new curriculum. Now, that's not, I don't think, in any way an impingement on the creative freedom of an architect, because our freedom shouldn't be freedom from, it should be freedom for.
Yeah.
We have the freedom of our expertise and knowledge and skills to earn a living and to help the weakest in society, and to orient the richest in society to see their obligations to.
That's a good point. Would you, just to finish, I suppose, I would love you to, when we spoke last, you spoke very eloquently about, I think it was Kingsgate, about the way that you had structured that, but it might have been the zigzag building, but it was, or it might be the new one, it might be the Nova Place. The way that you have organized, working with your client, working with the various bodies and other professionals associated, structured a building that has this kind of reciprocity with the city. There's a fundamentally civic idea that's underpinning it, and its deportment as a building, as a piece of the city, a city that is kind of living. London's kind of an insane place, is doing this kind of it's a performative civicness that is evident in it. I think it was Kingsgate. I think it was, but I'm not sure.
Well, I guess what you're getting at is that I think there's a latent civic character to most situations, even if they've been obscured with road engineering and faceless, 300-meter long 1960s, blocks, and in that case, it's the grain on the other side of the street to the town hall, opposite where we were asked to work, where John Francis Bentley built the Catholic Cathedral and a series of mansion blocks. It was the streets which paid for the construction of the cathedral, which isn't oriented east, north, southwest on cardinal orientation, unlike most Christian churches, because it's built on the ruins of the foundations of an old prison, because this area of London was marshland. So when they drained the marshland and they got rid of the prison, they built this cathedral, and it has a kind of skewed orientation. It's kind of, I don't know, about 25 degrees or something. But because of the need to finance the construction of the cathedral, he built lots of housing. And so quite simply, through this process of, as I alluded to, making a model, just one day I picked up a block of this housing and just placed it on the other side of the street, as if the creation of some of the other modernist buildings came after the creation of our building. And that relationship, which is an offset of about 20 odd degrees, as I mentioned, to the town hall, which is parallel to the street, created a threshold, a naturally perspectival relationship, whereby the building appears deferential to it and creates a space that suddenly the base of the building, which was a kind of portico, is actually open on the side, so it becomes part of the city. And so we had retrospectively rehabilitated this modernist object, which previously was connected to two 300-meter long buildings either side of it, as part of the urban grain of the Victorian city. So we'd done a kind of retrospective injection of the history of architecture into the modernist architect who'd probably been deprived of it in his technical education in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And but I also knew that within the London Building Acts, I mean, a lot of this comes from reading John Summerson's George in London, and the effect of the Fire of London upon the building codes, or building acts, which became the building regulations, and the width of most, the depth of most buildings is no more than about 20 meters, because otherwise you need to introduce another fire escape, and that all stems from the Fire of London. And so when you, I think it's about I think it's about 24 meters. But when you map that onto our building, and you're kind of grappling with the insights at the same time, you realise that the ideal column grid for a concrete office building is 9 by 12 meters, which gives you the most economic size of columns and floor slabs. And then if you're trying to put capillary cold water pipe into the slab so that it can radiate coolth and thus mitigate the need for fossil fuel usage to cool the building in the summer months. And if you're trying to open the facade so that it can naturally ventilate, the mathematics of the most economic floor plate times ethics of sustainable environmental engineering times the scale of the city, which itself is growing from a very crude attempt to combine law, health and safety, and a civic attitude, which effectively Bentley is building on from the Georgians. You're doing something which isn't random or simply intuitive without any knowledge. It's a professional act. It's also a eureka moment. But yeah, in that case, the executive buildings is low towards the cathedral. It's a listed building. It's in the unitary development plan of the council that buildings should be no more than 6 stories. And in my case, being an Irish immigrant Catholic boy, is genuflecting, as they say at UCD, towards the cathedral, and it goes taller towards the town hall across the street, but steps back from it because I'm also a socialist, and it's deferential to the rule of law and to the democratic process. Now, in the facade, the zigzag is a long wall building, which becomes more statuesque as it goes from east to west. Sorry, from west to east, and the residential building is a kind of tower, and the facades are inverted. One has fins that are wider apart and get closer together to make the wall building look more statuesque. On the stone building, it's inverted because at the lower level there are more stone piers so that you don't see people in their underwear or on their balconies, and higher up, where it's higher than the building opposite, it's lighter. Now, that's also a physics diagram. The building is lighter at the top than it is at the bottom, uses less material. It uses the least amount of material so that it still is solar shading itself and doesn't need fossil fuels to heat it or cool it. Sorry, to cool it, well, obviously needs to, but it's letting in enough passive solar gain so that you're reducing the need for heating in the winter, and blah, 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 blah. So this is where the physics of architecture and the law and form making and knowledge of the history of our discipline come together. I mean, it's not, like I say, it's not rocket science, but it's also not just making shapes and dropping them on the site and then painting them funny colours, or doing kind of round windows and painting things pink and green, the kind of neo-postmodern thing, which it actually has nothing to do with postmodernism. But the first intellectual postmodernist critique of the city is the reinvention or rediscovery of the Nolli plan. And not looking at the city as a series of objects, but looking at the city of Rome, in Nolli's case, as a series of thresholds and more or less public spaces with a layered hierarchy of the absolutely public, the absolutely private, but most of the city is in between. And so the space that works in terms of the space on a plan and in the facade, and it allows people to have different personae. So you can be absolutely private in your bathroom, or you can be more or less absolutely public on the street, but you're not wearing pajamas, and you're not you're not nude, but then the balcony is this point where you can choose to be more civic or not. And Peter Carr wrote a very good essay about this called Civic Depth, when he says, in most houses, especially if you've got young children, even the loo isn't really private, because you don't want to put a lock on the door because they'll lock themselves in. So rather than seeing things as absolutely this or that, it's seeing things in terms of a layered hierarchy, and that's not just a metaphor. It's actually how, I think, traditionally, if you look at buildings before the invention of fossil fuels, that's what they were. A Venetian palazzo or a Florentine house, they have within them this architectural intelligence that arguably this is one of the kind of paradoxes of modernism, and why I'm writing about the third book now, the Neve Brown book, about the problem of modernism, because we've inherited ideals and lots of knowledge, but it's paradoxical because that there are faults with Neve Brown's work. The ground plane didn't work as well as he intended. There's not much program at ground plane. It's all housing, so there's kind of clever tricks in sectional step gardens. But architectural knowledge is evolving, and the influence of our colleagues in planning, but also in it sounds really dumb, but retail consultants can be really, really helpful. So one thing Landsec did, there's an area called Tenter Ground just up from our
That's
site.
the developer who are doing Nova with you.
Yeah, because they own so many buildings on the street. If you start, we don't need to encourage them. They're already thinking like an estate owner. Think of the great estates of London are building for centuries. It's not short-termism that they and it's a bullshit phrase, curate the retail experience, but they allow very, very small retailers, key cutters and cobblers, to have a very low rent shops on side streets, because they know if they don't do that, nobody will want to work there in one of their office buildings or buy a flat. And their civic pride and cultural ambition, whilst it's driven by the need to make money, is also much more longer term. It's even more the case when you get to people like Grosvenor, the Duke of Westminster's estate. You probably know, I only learnt this recently, but do you know, what's it called? Lamb's Conduit Street in, I think it's owned by Rugby School. The Rugby School rents that. I mean, I'm no advocate for Rugby School, but, it's where you get all the shops where architects buy their clothes, Folk and Universal Works and stuff. And it's because they're taking a view about avoiding the chains coming in and taking it, not making as much money as required, but having a much longer view about it. I think your point about work is really, really key. I think if you can see what you're doing in terms of a contribution and being part of something, then it's possible to deal with filthy lucre and bankers and and people in the art world. Dalibor Vesely used to point out, the guy who was one of my teachers, he said the great kind of mystery is, and that's why I kind of no longer do art galleries, but you do a project for a banker or a property developer, they're often they like one of my clients, they haven't just studied land economy or whatnot. They've studied serious subjects at serious universities, and one of my clients, his wife is professor of music at Manchester, used to be a fellow at Cambridge, and they're very, very civilized, cultivated people. They love art, they love supporting artists, and they will pay you properly if you can help them achieve their goals. But they're also kind of suspicious of architects who are disrespectful of the city, which is inevitably an economic machine. Now I have other clients who are local authorities, and we're living in an age where they need to make money to sell 3 blocks of flats on our site for Hoxton for Hackney Council. And in fact, one of them, which will be sold for market housing, will pay for the construction of the 2 other buildings, which means the council isn't getting into debt. Now, that's the economic model that we have at the moment. It's not the same as the Neve Brown era. But as Mark Swanerton points out in his book, Cook's Camden, the reason why Camden were able to build so much housing is because it's a very long, thin borough. And its rates it was getting from the shop owners in and office tenants in Covent Garden was paying for architects of the quality of Neve Brown and Benson and Forsyth, Peter Tabori, to build this beautiful housing. And that's a kind of simple kind of lesson in, being alive to the world, keeping your eyes open, and not being not allowing yourself to be disoriented by a myth of absolute autonomous volition as an architect.
Or even desiring it, I suspect. Even desiring it. I mean, it's a peculiar thing, as you say. It's Ayn Randian kind of idea of fetishization of rugged individuality, which I don't think has made anybody very happy. Just to finish up, I did wonder if you could. You've talked quite a bit, I suppose, about how we go about what this thing is. And I really enjoyed your description of this. Various descriptions of, particularly of the building, of this idea of an architecture which is integrated into the civic culture at large. How do we teach something like that in our architecture schools? Because we try, it's very difficult, but quite clearly we're not trying enough, and it would be quite interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh God, I kind of sound like a grumpy old git, but it's.
I think there's space for grumpy old gits. It takes many folk to build a world, doesn't it?
I mean, I'm kind of endlessly optimistic. I'm not very grumpy. It's just that I think that there are some simple things that we can fix very easily. Not that I'm in a position to do so, or I had an opportunity to become a head of an architecture school a couple of years ago. I wouldn't stop practicing, and I stubbornly think that it's possible to do both. Tom Emerson is, eminent architect and head of the ETH at the moment.
Who is he?
Yeah, the same is true of Yale until recently had what's it called? Bob, I can't remember his surname. And same with Mendrisio. So it's completely possible. In fact, it's the norm elsewhere. I think one problem is the importation of art historians into architecture schools, because they have PhDs and can teach what was called history and theory, is problematic, because they don't know anything about theory. Or if they do, they know a theory of architecture which is informed by art history. Mm-hmm. So ideas of the sublime, the individual, emphasis on the individual genius and on epochs, tends to lack any political theory. Whereas most architectural theory, I'm thinking of Tafuri and Rossi, for example, is very political. It's Marxist, and but it's also a formal critique and a critique of technology. So I think the current funding model of universities getting money for research grants, rather than just saying, well, the students have paid loads of money, just teach them what they need to know as architects. Mm-hmm. What do they know about history? So the course I used to run at Cambridge, undergraduate history and theory course, which I'd inherited from an art historian, which was previously based on the kind of great white man view of history, a lecture on Michelangelo, the genius, a lecture on Palladio. We still talked about those people, but we spoke about them from the point of view of what they were actually doing. So Michelangelo is a political prisoner because Florence was at war with the Pope. And part of war reparations was the painting of the Sistine Chapel. In doing so, for example, he discovered that the plaster that he was supposed to be painting into when it was wet, frescoes, was substandard. And that's because Raphael was skimming off the money his client was giving him. And so you would blow on the plaster a day later and the paint would blow away, the colour would blow away. And in doing so, what Michelangelo then let himself into was staying for another 6 years and having to be the architect for St. Peter's, because he discovered an ethical or practical technical tectonic crime. So it's not, and he famously was like, I'm a sculptor, I'm not a painter, and I'm definitely not a bloody architect, but this is what happens to you if you're talented. And similarly, the idea that Palladio's work is entirely autonomous is just nonsense. If you look at the Piazza della Regione, the town hall in Vicenza, it's a series of arches, a kind of temple or Antica Roman building placed in front of shops at the ground floor, the burghers of the Consigliere, which were paying for the town hall. So whilst all the arches are the same, the intercolonnation is completely different, so that you can still shop in the shops. That's what paid for the bloody great room on the top and the creation of this noble facade. So that was a way of teaching history in theory that's grounded in, the political, economic, social situation in which architects are called to build. And there are people like Ackerman who wrote about how people did drawings, why they did drawings, and how drawings were taken by horseback. So how Alberti in Florence can have a building site in Rimini, and how he could communicate, and how marks were made. Why models were important, why one-to-one models were important, because they were contract documents handed over. So this, I think this is history in theory. It's the theory of architecture. It's how do we do architecture? But that's not how art historians are taught. So I think the old curriculum had a problem in it. History in theory was given to people who were pretty good historians, but really not very interested in either the intellectual theory of architecture or the practical theory of architecture. So that's one thing I think that can be fixed quite quickly. And on the simultaneously practice management and law, it is generally taught by kind of one-man band practitioners who are not really dealing with design build contracts, or really dealing with large contractors generally. And so there's this kind of fetishization of the role of the architect as contract administrator. Well, how do you kind of develop the nous and the strategy and the tactic to deal with a situation when you're powerless, where you have no power to say, no, I don't like it, and stop. So therefore you need to be much, much more strategic, and whether the IRP work stages get collapsed, and the BIM model helps. Because if you can think about environmental issues exactly at the point when you're thinking about form making, not as a bolt-on. But I think we can teach that in the design studio. The third aspect, which I think, as I mentioned, is collaboration. So I think group work is key, and group work on making site models together is really helpful for people, because stronger personalities will help people who are less confident, and less confident people grow in confidence very quickly when there's something physical that's made that you can talk about together. The emphasis on you doing it on your own, there's a huge mental health crisis in universities generally, and in young people, but specifically within architecture, because of this emphasis on you doing it on your own, and you having to be a genius before you know anything. So I'm very old-fashioned. I think that in order to develop conscience, you need to have skills, and those skills are partly rhetorical, so that you learn to argue reasonably, logically, and well, and to be able to take criticism, but also that you're basing that on discoveries made physically with others, so that you can refer to each other's witness, you can advocate, and you can have a testimony which is not just entirely subjective and personal, it's intersubjective and shared. And that in microcosm mirrors the act of being assistant and being a barrister or a lawyer or a scientist. Even you're referring to other people's work, and you're situating your work in relationship to it. So if we could kind of be properly professional, I think we would become proper activists. So for me, we're interested in housing's a massive crisis personally for young people all over the world. So why are we not teaching housing properly? Why are we not making the entire fourth year housing, the theory of housing, the examples of housing, the actual practical experience of it? Because that's somewhere within all the kind of use sectors or use classes or whatever people want to describe architecture as, where we have real agency again for the first time since the late 60s, before Thatcher came to power and modernism retreated into a formalist, narcissistic game of, no consequence. It's something that allows the architect, as a human being, as a political person in their private life, and as a political person in their public persona as a professional, to gain traction. And how do we do it? Well, we don't just make all the same fucking stupid mistakes that people made the first time around when they were building tower blocks in a sea of cars, thinking that if you put shiny colours on things, it'll all be all right, and then people end up dying. There's a gravity to this. You can sense I have a kind of moral force, I think, that's probably scary, because it comes from a place of personal political commitment. It's not I mean, it sounds like I'm a bit kind of authoritative and boring, but I think ultimately what I'm interested in is actual freedom. How do you get to do what you really want, which is to make beautiful things that enable you to earn a decent living, win awards, have people sing your praises, and actually nobody know who the architect is. It doesn't matter, because they're just doing things anyway, because you're building, or the project that you've created is a kind of, super vulnerable, tense background with enough stability, so that space can become a memorial for the dead of the First World War, because you haven't put any shops in it.
Mm.
You put the shops elsewhere on the site where retailers can make money, but you don't need it there. So that therefore it can become something which is taken over by the res publican, by the polis, literally the politicians going, let's put a memorial to the dead of the First World War in it. And whilst it's kind of irritating because it's not the sculpture I would have chosen, and they took a tree up to put it there, which seems a bit silly. You can't control everything, and it will be there after you're dead. And we all, don't want our buildings to be knocked down. So how you can, deal with that kind of ego? You don't want things to be knocked down because they're obsolete and crap, because they're evil and they're gas guzzling, and they won't work in a post-fossil fuel future. But you also don't want it to be knocked down because people hate them, because they can't interact with them or participate with them or actually change them. But that's a bigger question. I don't know about this. I mean, I'm kind of getting there through my idea of reasonable strategy and embodied intuition. But it's a big question for us as a profession, and it has to do, as you said, this Ayn Randian notion of solipsistic individualism. I mean, that's a big problem, and it's a big problem within education, because it's how education is being sold. And so we need the support of government. We need the support of the RBA and the ARB, which I think is coming through the prescribed curriculum now, and we need the support of vice chancellors. We need people in positions of political power to start to see the capacity of architecture. It's a bit chicken and egg. I think the more social housing that we build, and the more the public starts to recognise the role of architects in society again, the more they will support us and value us.
Brilliant. That's a perfect point to finish on. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Well, that was fun. Thanks to Patrick for joining me, sharing some great texts and discussing his building so poetically, and for his great patience and tenacity too. Please see the podcast description for links to Lynch Architects, Canal Side Press and the books we spoke about, and Patrick's other professional connections. And please share this episode all over. Thanks for listening. Cheers.